Hi everyone and welcome to week 8 sections. My name is Yulia and I'm a preceptor here on Harvard's campus helping with all things CS50 on campus and online. And today we're diving into week 8, which is web, right? So talking all things HTML, JavaScript, CSS, how to build those web pages, what comes into those pages that you've been seeing online probably for years right now, and hopefully some applicable tools and skills that you'll take away from today's section. But let's look at the agenda a little bit. So what is on the menu today? Let's talk first about HTTP and what that means. We will then look at HTML, which is, like the core, the main elements and tags of our web pages, like something that makes the website functional. And then lastly, we'll jump into CSS and JavaScript. So CSS is all things stylistic, so like how to make our web pages look pretty, changing the fonts, the colors, titles, and JavaScript is what makes the website a little bit more interactive, right? Not just the static pages that gets rendered in your browser, but somewhere we can click and poke and see some dynamic results outputted on the page. So looking at HTTP first, like what does it stand for? And HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And this is the protocol that allows sort of like your computer to interact with the server and actually render those web pages, right? Like sort of output what you're seeing on the screen. And in particular, what is really helpful about it is HTTP server, which is the command that we're going to run quite frequently this week, just so that we can actually see the output, the product of those web pages that we're building together. And what HTTP server does is just setting up a local server where you can test your files, your web pages, instead of having to, connect it to the bigger server like the big websites do. So a very helpful tool that we will use all of this week. And probably if you're developing any sort of website, this would be really in handy to test things locally before you push it into the big world. And then a big chunk of our time will be spent on HTML, which is what we're going to jump right in right now. So before we get started with some of the, theoretical stuff, let's actually poke around in one of the HTML files that I brought with us today. So I'm going to flip my screen and let me zoom in a little bit here. So what we see on the left is an HTML file, and on the right, I already called an HTTP server command in the terminal right here. So that's why I already have a web page rendered, just so that we can compare it one by one. We will skip the style part for now. We're going to get back to it in a second, but let's look at some of the components of the HTML sort of like part itself. So what we can see right now is a bunch of different tags, right? And it's already sort of like indented and they have some text in them already, but what do they actually mean? We'll see a sort of better visualization in the slides in just a second, but this is how HTML files are generally structured. So we have an HTML tag that sort of like opens up the file and let us know that like this will actually be an HTML file and for computer to look out for those tags. And then comes all the other ones. So head and body are the two sort of like big sub tags that encapsulate some information. Inside of body is actually the table that we see right here on the right. And maybe let me zoom in a little bit as well, if it'll let me. Okay. And these are all the elements that help us create the table that we see on the right. And let's go back. Let's pause here, and I know it might be confusing, but let's go back to the slide and maybe see a better visualization of what's going on. So here is how we can think about HTML as sort of like a tree, right? Instead of seeing all of that code, this is how we might want to visualize it. And in fact, HTML is structured like a tree with some parent tags and then the child tags that go off of them. And so as we just saw, in the beginning of every HTML file, we will have the opening HTML tag. This is what is helping computer understand that this is actually an HTML file that it's going to look at. And then, as I mentioned, it is split into a head and body. And the difference is that head contains that metadata, like something that is not necessarily visible to the user, but something that is really helpful for the file and for the computer. For example, the title of your web page or the style, so those CSS attributes that we're going to talk about in just a second. You can also put script inside of the head, or you can also put it inside of the body, and we will talk about the choices around why and how. And then on the right-hand side is the body, which is probably the part that you will end up working with the most, because this is where all of the juicy, detailed stuff is happening. So one part is the script, and we're going to touch on that in the very end when we're talking about JavaScript. But let's focus on the table part for now. So obviously this is not the entire tree that we just saw in the HTML file. So if we take another step into it and dive deeper, this is what we might see sort of like underneath the hood. And let me make this full screen and talk about all of the elements that we see here. So the same concept as, opening was the body tag. The table tag creates this sort of like division, this component where it says, okay, this is where we're going to have our table. But obviously just by saying the table, it's not going to automatically create one, right? How is it supposed to know if it's supposed to be, 5 rows or 10 rows or 10 columns or 20 columns? This is something that you need very detailed and programmatically tell the computer to do. So if we look at this first branch, TR is what stands for the row, right? Like this is creating the first row in your table. And right now it might not be super clear because it's left to right, but in the actual HTML file, this would be top to bottom. So creating the first row, we then need to specify each of the elements, or TD. And so this allows us to create the actual cells. So coming down from the big table tag into a specific row. So now we're sort of like zooming in on a smaller and smaller details. Now we can see that one of the elements, the first cell in the first row will be called team 1, and the second cell in the first row would be called team 2. And again, this is something that is called elements. So tags create elements, and tags are things like table and TR and TD. And so they create these like cells in this case, right? That is called team 1. And again, the text is something that you specify in between those tags. And as we go on and on, we can create more rows, right? And more columns. So for example, we're creating a second row. We're going to keep track of the score. And then the third row, where we're going to actually add those scores. And notice here that in the third row, we actually take it even a level deeper. So we're not just stopping at the specific cell or like element of the row, we're actually designating it as a button, right? So we're adding a button to our element instead of it being just a plain text. And so if we go back to our CS50.dev, right, this is exactly what we're seeing here. So inside of body, we have a table tag that sort of says, hey computer, here's where the table is going to be. And then as we just saw, left to right, we're creating these tags actually top to bottom, and that is how they translate on the web page right next to it to the right. And the overarching goal of this exercise is to show like a small toy example of how to work with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And we're starting with like pretty bare bones, right? Like there's not that much going on in here. Like we have a table with 3 rows, and then there's already some JavaScript code pre-written, but we're gonna get to that in just a second. But there's not that much more going on, right? So maybe let's add on some things. So again, feel free to follow along or do it on your own after that. But let's go back to CS50.dev and try to add on some elements. So what do we think could be helpful here, right? So I just have like a table, but it's not really telling me, okay, like what is team 1, what is team 2, what is going on here? What elements could be helpful to add to this page? And I'll take your suggestions from the chat. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna get to colors in just a second, but maybe some of the things that we could add would be, for example, having a header, right? So something on very top of the page that would tell a user that will be looking at it, exactly what is going on. And we can say something like, example from CS50 week 8 section, right? That can tell the user exactly what is going on here. We could also, in the same way, add a footer. So adding it to the bottom, we can say made by Yulia. We could also create some other components. So for example, we can add a paragraph tag that says team 1 versus team 2. And notice that once I click Command Save right here, and then I reload this page, now I have more elements on my web page, right? So now I have a header, a footer, and the table itself. And let me actually, instead of making it a paragraph, let me make it header 1, just so that it is, oops, I didn't close the tag. It's okay, so reload again. Okay, so now we have team 1 versus team 2 as a big header, right? It's more apparent on our web page, and then we have our header and our footer on the bottom. And how did I know about these tags? Like, how did I choose to implement them, right? I have some cheat sheet probably, and I have some previous knowledge, and I know what things to look out for. But really, as we go into web development and playing around with HTML and CSS, there's so many different tags. There's so many different attributes that exist out there, and we could not have possibly have all this time to explain all of the little details to you. So this is truly the week where you need to embrace Googling, embrace like independent research, and look out for those things yourself, and not just take all the sort of like details and resources that we give you as an exhaustive list. So we've added some things to it, and it looks already better, but how do we make it even better? So next thing we can talk about then is CSS, right? So this is the part that gives us that style, those colors, like interesting design components that we can implement on the website. And how exactly does CSS work? Well, the syntax for it is relatively simple, right? We just need to have a selector, so something that CSS can identify what element you're talking about, right? Like if I'm just gonna say, okay, make this bold or make this red, CSS is going to be like, make what red, right? It needs to know exactly what elements you want to change. And this is where selectors come in, and they can come in various forms. So if we look at our table tree from before, some things that we can sort of like grab and modify are the elements or the tags themselves, right? For example, if I wanted to change the properties of every single element in my table, I might grab it by the TD tag. And in that case, in the syntax, you just specify TD, opening parentheses, and whatever properties you want to input inside of it. If I wanted to go a little bit more specific, though, I would say something like hashtag, and the hashtag specifies the ID, followed by the ID name. So maybe if we go back to our tree, right, I'm looking at the specific element that actually keeps track of my score, right? Maybe it would be for purposes for changing that score or changing the color once the team won. I want to make sure that I can grab that specific element and my computer or the program doesn't confuse it with any others. So I would give it a specific ID that is unique and that I could sort of like grab it by this specific unique ID and modify some things later on. But what about if I have just a few elements that I want to modify, not the entire category of elements? Well, then I could use class that is specified by a dot. And in that case, I can attribute it to multiple elements. So in this case, maybe I just want to change the properties of the top row. And so I'm giving it a specific class that I could later grab it by and use it later on. And it is, interesting to think about, where do we attribute as a class? Where do we attribute as an ID? And it really will come to you as you're doing programming, right, or writing the entire page. Like from the get-go, if I had this table, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you which one I wanted to be a class, which one I wanted to be an ID. Do I even need to specify anything? But as you're thinking about the functionalities of your website, like what specific elements do I anticipate grabbing as you're looking at the style of your web page, right? If I want to make multiple elements of the same format, perhaps class would be a better choice, because then I don't have to specify a style for each single ID. But if I want to just grab one specific element and, for example, grab it for the score purposes or changing it to some other color when the team won, ID would be a better friend to use, because then you can guarantee that you're just having this unique ID that you can rely on. So that being said, let's practice with some CSS attributes. And again, this is definitely not an exhaustive list, and we're having a toy example of just exploring different functionalities and syntax, and definitely feel free to explore more of those CSS selectors that exist out there. But for now, let's go back to our scoreboard and let's actually explore the style tag right above. So you can see that we already added some stylistic choices. So for example, we've modified the table quite a bit. So we added some border formatting, text alignment, margins, right? Just so that we can make it a little bit more readable, in the same way where we also made the elements have a thicker border than before. But let's talk about some other things that we can implement here. For example, if I wanted to make the top row, so team 1 and team 2, have a specific background color, how might I go about that? First of all, would I use a class or ID? If I wanted to modify class, yeah, exactly. So if I wanted to use class, I might want to look at these specific elements. So I would maybe give it a class called team for both of these elements, because this is where I want to modify the color. And then I would go back to my style tag, and inside of it, I would specify those CSS attributes. So for example, I'm using class, so dot is how I would tell the computer that it's actually a class, not an ID. And then just following the syntax, let's change the background color to, and I have some pre-written hexadecimal colors that I found before. Let's see, D8, BF, DF, semicolon. Let's save this. Let's reload this. Oh, okay, so I made a mistake. So I said dot class, but my class is equal to team. So I need to say dot team to actually specify the class. And if I reloaded, now I see that the color is actually changed to this light purple color that now we have on the first row. Okay, and if I wanted to maybe differentiate between the team 1 score and the team 2 score, and maybe have team 1 be the blue team and team 2 be the red team, right? I want to have different colors for those two elements. So in this case, would I use ID or class? if I wanted to give, for example, this score a blue color and this score a red color, would I use a class or ID? Yeah, exactly, ID. And actually, now that I'm looking at line 35 and 36, where I'm building this element, I can already see that they have IDs assigned to them. So that makes my job easier. And I can just go in and now with the hashtag, specify that specific ID and maybe giving it a background color. And I also brought a specific hexadecimal for that. Let's give it hashtag ADD8E6. And then for score 2, background color, hashtag FFA07A. Okay, save it here and let's reload here. And now I see, maybe let me zoom out for a second. Now I see that the top row, right, is uniform, is the same color, but the elements inside, right, that specify the score are actually different colors. So playing around a little bit with the CSS attributes. And let's talk about just one more thing, right? We've seen in the lecture that there are different ways to actually create those style attributes and specify them. So in this case, we're just using a style tag inside of the HTML file. Another option would be creating a separate style sheet and actually just linking it. And that would come really in handy. For example, you have multiple HTML pages where you want to maintain the same formatting. So instead of copy pasting the same thing between different HTML pages, you can just have one style sheet that is responsible for all the formatting across all of your web pages. But another small tool, and again, it'd be a little controversial, is specifying the style directly in the header. For example, if I wanted my H1 header, right, team 1 versus team 2 to be center aligned, I could specify the style directly inside of my tag. So specifying text align, center, semicolon, quotes, I can create that CSS formatting right inside of my tag. And if I reload it now, team 1 versus team 2, the header aligns on the center and is now right above my table. Okay, and again, there are definitely like various ways you can create the CSS attributes, but these are just some of them. And let me pause here and ask, what questions do we have about HTML or CSS so far? Okay, so let's see. Yeah, so someone asked, can you change the style sheet on the HTML file itself for the updates and minor changes, for example? You can definitely have like a master CSS sheet that is between the web pages, and then having some specific ones to your HTML page. For example, like I did over here, I like specified it directly in the tag. There might be some restrictions on, you know, which one comes first, and that's something that you might want to play around with and find out, you know, if formatting inside of the style sheet overrides what is inside the tag or the other way around. That can be a fun exercise to explore. Okay, any other questions? Okay, seeing none for now, so let's move on and talk about JavaScript. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, JavaScript is what really allows us to make these static web pages, right, really interactive. So far, we haven't really modified anything much, right? We played around with some colors, some alignment, formatting, but there haven't been like any, you know, like major dynamic things that we could do with the website so that it's more interactive. Well, this is where JavaScript comes in handy, but how does it actually, you know, how do these all three languages connect together? Well, this is how we might pull it all together. So remember how in the very beginning, I was using the word like grab or select. And this is where I was sort of hinting about JavaScript, but this is just like a little preview of what the syntax might look like. So again, thinking about the tree and our elements, let's go over how exactly how JavaScript is able to grab these elements and modify them. So notice how the line of code starts with document. And this is exactly what we're seeing in our tree, right? On the very top, every HTML file will start with this like top to bottom approach, where in the very beginning, we have the document that specifies that it will be HTML, and then it is going top to bottom, looking at every single level until we reach, for this case, the exact ID that we were looking for, #add1. Right? So even if it's not like, there's a little bit of magic behind it, right? You're just saying, okay, grab this ID, but how it is actually going on, it is actually just tracing the entire tree, looking for the specific ID that you specified to it. And that's just grabbing it, right? That's just sort of recording it in the memory, being like, okay, we grabbed that element, but now what can we do with it? And this is where the events come in, right? And that's something that David also talked in the lecture. There are so many different events that you can specify. And in this case, for example, maybe we are looking for the event called onClick, right? So that is actually when you click with your mouse on the specific element. And since we read everything left to right, this would literally be look at the document, then select the specific ID, #add1, because this is what we put in the parentheses, and then look out for event onClicked. So that would be just, anticipating something and taking some action after the event occurs. But what other changes can we make? So another one is called .innerHTML. And again, we're reading it left to right. So looking at it one step at a time, in this case, we would grab some specific element with the ID _1, and then we would modify that innerHTML and looking at the specific score. And in the beginning, remember, we just set the score to 0, but now using these JavaScript tools, we can actually make it a little bit more dynamic, right? And we'll actually go back to the web page and see how some of these dynamic changes are already implemented, but we will certainly add on more to them. So let's go over here and let's actually scroll to the part that I was hiding a little bit in the beginning, right? So this is where sort of like all the JavaScript magic is going on. So let's go through it line by line. So notice that first we have the script tag. And as you might remember in the beginning, I mentioned that it can be either on top or on the bottom. And the choice would really come from the functionalities that you're hoping to implement in that script. If it is something that you would want to implement like even before sort of the user interacts with the web page or it loads, then you might want to put the script on top of the HTML file. But if it is something that you would, some functionalities that you would hope to implement after the web page is loaded, putting it on the bottom is more handy, because if I put this code on top, when it's running, for example, line 60, it wouldn't even know what #add1 is because we haven't reached that point in the HTML file yet. And of course, there's also a third option of isolating JavaScript completely into a third file where you're implementing all this code. But let's focus on this for now, and let's go through it one by one. So again, funky JavaScript syntax that is really very translatable to what we've been doing in C and in Python so far. So in the very beginning, we're setting up two variables, team1 and team2, that are helping us keep the score of the current team. And then after that, this is where we have those, events and the query selector. So we're grabbing the element #add1, and it would be this button right here because that is what we specified. And then after it is clicked, what is going to happen is we will increment team 1 by 1. And then we, of course, need to reflect it on our web page, right? If I'm just leaving it on line 61, nothing's going to be reflected on the web page. It's going to go somewhere, like in the backstage, but I'm not going to see it on the web page. So that's why the line 62 action is so important for actually displaying it on the web page and changing that inner HTML. And in the exact same way, I would do it for team 2 as well, adding in the scores. And right now, the scores just kind of like go on, right? Like I keep clicking on the either and nothing is changing. So let me propose that a goal for this part of our section would be to implement some code that would actually stop, right? Or at least alert us when one of the teams had reached 5 points. So for that, let me reset the web page and let us take a look at the JavaScript code. So what are some things we can do here in order to make it even more dynamic, right? And have some identification of when one of the team won. Well, thinking logically about it, right, in the same way that we've been doing C and in Python, we would probably want to go with some kind of if statement, right? So after we added on a score, and after we change the score on the web page, something that we might want to ask ourselves, is the score equal to 5? And the equal signs are back, so that's what still we're using for comparison. And let me open the curly braces. And inside of them, what are some changes that I want to make, right? If the score is indeed 5, which means that team 1 won, what are some things that I want to do? Well, I might want to just alert that team 1 won, okay? And then same for team 2, I might check their score. And if they did win, let me indent this, I would alert that team 2 won. All right, so let me save this. Let me reload the web page. And now if I get to 5, hopefully I see an alert, which is nice, right? Like right now it stops and it is showing us that team 1 had actually won. But let's talk about some other ways to do it, right? Like the alert is nice, but there's nothing much else going on. So let me propose that we can do something better, and let's try to test it on team 1 for now. What if I wanted to implement some kind of like alert right on top of my table? But I don't want it to be apparent right away, right? While my user is still playing around with it, I just want to be able to see nothing. But once, for example, I reach 5 points, I want to be able to see some kind of message right above the table. And this is where, again, the ability of grabbing by the IDs and having this JavaScript dynamic feature is really helpful. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create an empty tag right under my header. So I'm going to create just a paragraph tag, and I'm not going to put anything into it because I want it to be empty as soon as the page loads, but I will specify its ID so that I can find it later on. And I'm going to call it feedback. And what's going to happen inside of the JavaScript code is, instead of just using the alert that we just saw, I might do something like this. Document, query selector. Let me look at the code that I have. Query selector, ID feedback. So hashtag feedback. And then changing its inner HTML or the text inside of the tags to team 1 won. Semicolon, let me save this, let me reload the page. And now if I reach 5 points for team 1, I should see a message that pops up right here, right? It wasn't there before, but given the JavaScript functionalities and this like dynamic features, we were able to add on this message that only pops up once some condition is fulfilled. And just for consistency's sake, let me copy this over to team 2, just changing the message. But what are some other things we can do? Well, what if I wanted to change the background color, right? So maybe after team 1 wins, I wanted score to become green, and then team 2's score to become red, or the other way around. These are also things that I can specify. So in a very similar way, I would grab first document. Inside of that document, I would select a specific element by its ID. So in this case, it would be score 1. And then I would specify that I want to change the background color to green if the team won. And then for the other team that lost, I would specify it to be red. So selector, ID score 2, background color equals red. And let me just copy this over for the other element as well. And I'm just going to change this to red and this to green. And let's cross our fingers and reload. So if I'm hitting this, maybe a little bit for team 2, but ultimately I want to hit 5 for team 1. Did I misspell something? So I see the message, but I'm not seeing the color change. And that actually might be because I already have some color preset up right here. So maybe for the sake of the example, let's change these to the button colors and then see if we can have this work. Okay, so what I did right now is just change the IDs to the IDs of the buttons. So see how the color swapped a little bit. So now let's see if the code that I tested before will actually work. All right, let's try to hit 5 for team 1. Okay, I'm seeing the message, but I'm not seeing the color change. Oh, okay. I'm missing one part in this code. So the part that was missing is style. So we need to specify that we're looking at the document, we're grabbing a specific element, and then we're actually changing the style of that element. And let's try this one more time. So reload. Get some score for both teams, but then try to hit 5 for team 1, and yay, it works. Let me zoom out, and we see the message that popped up on the very top, and then the color changed inside of the cell scores that would indicate that, again, team 1 won and team 2 lost. So actually, I didn't need to go and change the CSS attributes that I did before. It was just a little mistake that I missed the sort of like the style part inside of my JavaScript code. Okay. So let me pause here and ask what questions do we have about this little exercise. Again, this is just like some of the small things that you can try to do, but the concepts themselves are grounded in this idea of having a tree and then the unique IDs by which you can grab the specific elements and then implement some changes with them. And there's certainly a lot more beyond just changing the text and the colors, but these are just some examples. So someone asked, would it also work with green as lowercase g? Let's find out. Let's see, I actually haven't tested that. So let's reload the page and let's try to hit 5 here. And it does. Yeah, so turns out the computer is really smart and it can figure out what you were saying regardless of if it's lowercase or uppercase. You could also be very explicit and, for example, how I did on the very top, specify the hexadecimal number of the color. That just gives you like a little bit more precision regarding what you want to pick. But if you use the regular colors like red, green, yellow, it will understand what you mean. Yeah, good question though. It was a fun test. Any other questions? Any other questions that we have so far? Yeah, so I think the team plus, like the variable plus syntax is just for C. But let's check that. I think it is just for C, but for good measure, let's see if it would work. Okay, so it does. Yeah, so I guess you can also use plus in JavaScript. So that was a nice finding. I didn't know about that. Again, whenever in doubt, this will always work because this is just literally the regular syntax where we use anywhere. But good observation. Any other questions? Okay. So thank you so much for joining us today. This was HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and all things web development. Hopefully this gives you a little taste, right? A preview of all the things you can accomplish in web development using these tools. My name is Julia, and this was CS50 Week 8, and hope to see you next time.